Hey, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you are a returning subscriber, hey, bestie, hope you're having an amazing day. You see what happens when you subscribe, you get a bonus greeting on every single episode. In this episode, we talked to Greg Shultz, who runs a really cool consulting business. He has a phenomenal background working at BlackRock and Morgan Stanley, building compliance programs for really complex businesses. And I think his experience really gives some tips for all of us who are trying to drive change in our organization on how to actually drive that change and how to frame out what our initiatives are in a way that resonates with the people whose adherence to those initiatives is critical for our own success. So I hope you enjoy it. Take care.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Greg, pretty excited to get you on, man. How's it going?
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So I'd love to just dive right in. I think you have a really cool background, and I think the angle that you look at this whole industry in is pretty unique. So maybe we can start about kind of how you sort of slipped off the log and fell into this compliance pool, or maybe tell us how you sort of started walking toward that log.
I mean, I don't think you could explain it better. It was an accident. Originally thought I was going to go into the feds and do federal law enforcement, and got an opportunity randomly to go work at the United Nations, which kind of kickstarted my career, working on the Oil for Food program, which was a $60 billion asset misappropriation by Saddam Hussein, his regime. And from there, people were talking to me about this new FCPA thing that was getting really big, and jumped over to Deloitte, started doing FCPA consulting, proactive compliance, build outs, risk assessments, the whole lot. Then got an opportunity to interview with Morgan Stanley, who was having a small issue in China.
Ah, the old small issue in China routine.
Yes. Yeah. So Morgan Stanley hired me to move out to Hong Kong on the back end of their FCPA investigation in 2010. Thought I was going 2 years, and I stayed 11.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So on the back end of that investigation, and then we got the declination from the SEC, we continued to build out the program in Asia with a particular focus on private equity. And what our portfolio companies where they were getting set up in high-risk jurisdictions, infrastructure, real estate across the board. Did that for a few years, and then ran my own consulting business in Shanghai, which was awesome. I went to business school at Emory and always had an entrepreneurial mindset. So basically took a chance and started that in Shanghai, did that for a couple of years, and then BlackRock hired me back in Hong Kong. So I went from a ABC kind of consulting role into a financial crime generalist role, sanctions, AML, fraud, across the gamut. And was with BlackRock for about 10 years, eventually moved into a global head of anti-corruption role, built their program from the ground up. I was the first person in the group. And I am now back in my own consulting shop, wanting to kick off that entrepreneurial spirit again.
What a journey, man. That's so cool.
Yeah.
So you said that you wanted to go into law enforcement. What is it about law enforcement that was attractive to you? What drew you to that field?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that. I think in my first school out of university, my first job out of university, I was doing internal investigations for a large bank here in Atlanta. And a lot of the work that I was dealing with, we had to hand over to federal law enforcement, check fraud schemes, massive misappropriation of funds, and so forth. I think that kind of got me an interest in it. Also, my undergrad was in criminal justice. So I think I've always had an interest in doing something to give back, so to speak.
Yeah.
And hence why I went to the UN. But it was go work in federal law enforcement or move to New York City and work at the United Nations. It was quite an easy choice.
It was like one or the other. So I'd love to hear some more about that UN experience, because I'm sure that was extremely interesting. You were working on a really interesting case, I guess.
Yep.
with the Saddam Hussein thing. Tell me a
Yep.
little bit about that and like what you really learned from that experience, because you're dealing with a different culture and it's the
Yep.
kind of the same sort of human things of corruption that we
Yep.
see on any side of any pond. You know what I mean? But I'm sure there were some
Sure.
like really interesting nuances that were maybe culturally based or just kind of situation based.
Yeah, so basically, the gist of the story was after the first war in Iraq, the UN took over to oversee the sale of Iraqi oil for the purchase of humanitarian aid for the people of Iraq. So essentially, buying medicine and food for the people of Iraq. And with the UN being the broker between those two sides of the equation, you have it's 130 something countries involved in trying to manage that, and hence with different cultures and different business practices from those 130 something countries, things fall apart, and that's exactly what happened. So oil was getting sold, people were not getting their medicine and their food in Iraq, and the people in Iraq were suffering. So we were engaged by the Iraqi government to go in and investigate where the fraud, corruption was, and take those companies and individuals public to make sure that they pay for it. And as you mentioned, yeah, it was dealing with many different cultures and a very difficult system.
Yeah.
When you have so many countries involved with different backgrounds where they think something's normal, but most people do not.
So when you got in there, they brought you in, you said, to like find where this corruption was happening and how it was happening. So where was it happening? Was it just everywhere, or did you see some trends or what?
It was everywhere because you had a bunch of companies that were engaged by the UN to lift the oil in Iraq. So those companies
I gotcha.
lifting oil, and they weren't sending it where they were supposed to. You had a bank that was engaged to oversee the oil transfers and the money, which was BNP Paribas. And then you had, very basic corruption, the procurement office in the United Nations full of employees that were in charge of selecting vendors on behalf of this $60 billion program.
So at the UN side, like what incentive did those employees have to be corrupt?
Yeah, so they were getting kickbacks, essentially.
They were just getting kickbacks. Okay.
Yeah. So, we did an enormous amount of interviews, documentation, email discovery to find out what was going on, and what we found was unbelievable. So the
it sounds crazy.
Investigation was 13 months, could have gone years more. We were about 60 people strong, representing 25 different countries of investigators.
Wow.
So we had Interpol agents, FBI, DEA, ATF, special forces, federal prosecutors. It was a very, very strong group of people.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, it's like you need a whole army of investigators to go and investigate this massive issue across all these different jurisdictions and countries and companies and stuff like that.
Yep.
What was that like? I'm sure that required a ton of coordination, right? Because there's all these little individual conversations going on that need to come together, and they need to be sort of like boiled down to like, well, what's actually happening? Like, how did you get started in the process? Where they're just like, hey, I think there's a problem, and then this army shows up, or and then along the way, what was that coordination like? That sounds really
So from the top down, basically the UN appointed a investigation council, which was led by former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker. Volcker was the head of the committee and was essentially who we reported up to in our reporting. But with obviously several layers between me and Mr. Volcker. People were stretched across the world. The travel was incredible because you're going out and meet people from all these different companies that were involved in the program.
Right.
From every corner of the earth.
Did you make platinum status that year?
That's a good point. I looking back, I probably made like triple platinum. Yeah.
Triple platinum. Yeah. Like, oh, here comes Greg. Let's get a set off. So like, what was your big takeaway from that? Because that was such a massive issue that you got to have kind of up close, like visibility into.
For me, it was probably the most rewarding thing I ever did.
Interesting.
Knowing that, we released, I think our report was 5,000 pages. Yeah, our final report was 5,000 pages. And we found money in, bank accounts in different parts of the earth. We got people in jail, companies got in trouble, and ultimately returned the money back, some of the money back to the Iraqi people, to the government. So
Cool.
that Saddam essentially tried to take from them.
Yeah. So, I mean, going back to your drive to get into this kind of field of kind of giving back, that was a very tangible thing where,
For sure.
sometimes we're fighting corruption and, people are arguing that it's a victimless crime. Here, there were actual victims. There were people that were supposed to be the beneficiaries of this oil that was pulled out, that weren't getting the food, the medicine, all that other stuff. So I bet that felt great.
100%. That's 100% correct. Yeah. But, the sad part of it, I have to say, is that, despite the amount of work and hours and time that went into this and money investigating it, there's still so much corruption.
Yeah, right.
Right. And with those companies, with these people, I'm sure a lot of them went right back into doing what they were doing before. But I think, with our best efforts, we made it was a big reward and a significant win.
So what made you leave, right? Like, you took some call from Morgan Stanley and you were kind of in this really great organization. You were doing really cool things, very rewarding things. What was it about that call where you're like, yeah, maybe I'll go to Hong Kong for a little bit? This sounds easy. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was, I was actually in business school at Emory and thinking I was going to move back to Atlanta, where I'm originally from. And I was sitting next to a guy who was a private wealth banker at Morgan Stanley. And he said, hey, I think we have this small corruption issue I think people are doing what you do at Morgan Stanley. Do you want to meet the people? I said, sure. So I was never given a role. I went through 15 interviews, the last one being the general counsel of Morgan Stanley at the time. And he was the one that said to me, by the way, you probably know this, but we've been interviewing you for a role. And it's not in the US, it's in Asia. So that kind of sparked my interest. Having traveled with the UN quite extensively, I never went to Europe, never went to Asia, but I saw it as an opportunity to expand upon what I did at the UN, and it was a no-brainer for me.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like such a cool opportunity. I mean, even just interviewing with the GC of Morgan Stanley is awesome. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So his first question, funny enough, is, so you're a Georgia Bulldog? I said, absolutely. And he goes, okay, good. Because if you can't talk football with me, you're not going to get this job.
Well, check mark.
Yeah.
So what was that like? I mean, that was kind of serendipity right there.
Yeah, it was good. It was very exciting at the time, and especially, at the end of it, when we got our declination from the SEC, you were able again to see a reward of work that you have put into a program. And running side by side with the investigation and watching what was happening, it was pretty impressive what our team did globally to help the bank.
Do you think at some level there's like a little bit more satisfaction from cleaning up a mess than, there's more satisfaction in cleaning up a mess than there is in like preventing a mess? I'm just thinking about your couple of, these couple of experiences that we kind of dove into. There was a certain closure to each one of these things, whereas, a typical kind of compliance person who's maybe trying to keep the lights on or trying to keep the train on the tracks, they sometimes don't get that same sort of closure and that same sort of dopamine hit that, look at that, we cleaned it up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think without a doubt. And in fact, during that time when there was a lot of SCPA investigations were going on, a lot more than there are now, you would constantly see compliance officers jumping from bank to bank to bank as they were trying to fix these programs. And once we fixed the program at Morgan Stanley, you slowly saw the team roll off into either a real estate investment fund or elsewhere to help them build out their programs. And essentially, that's what I did at BlackRock. BlackRock had nobody in Asia, and they said, "Hey, we're trying to build out a program here. Come do it with us."
So this is really part that this is really a part of your story that I wanted to kind of dive into, because this was a little bit more preventative, right? It's like, it's not like you were kind of, remediating an issue that like existed where you're dealing with, external regulators or something. They were like, hey, we need to kind of, bolster what we have in place. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about what that process was like, how you started to slot in and how you started to attack it, and what you gathered from those other, these other experiences that you had that allowed you to not only, stay at, the Death Star, no offense, for 10 years. I mean, that's a long time at BlackRock from what I understand.
Yep.
So you must have been having some kind of success there, and must have been sort of feeding you in some way beyond your paycheck to stay engaged and continue to build it. So I'd love to kind of dive into that.
Yeah, for sure. I think I didn't appreciate this at the time. I think moving from an investment bank into an asset manager was very, very interesting because they're completely two different businesses, and you're moving into a large bank, but then you're moving into the largest asset manager in the world,
right?
Who was growing very aggressively in APAC. With the growth and the excitement of the firm, I think that brought part of the excitement to the role. And I was now in a position where I can make the decisions to build something completely new and then educate these senior business leaders in Asia who haven't had anything in the past on why we're doing this and the reason for doing it.
Yeah. So what was that like? Did you find that easy or hard? Because you're not only dealing with a different industry that might, I don't know, that might have it probably has less regulation than a bank, right?
Yeah.
And then you're also in a part of the world that is maybe a little bit kind of less mature with respect to compliance programs in general that kind of exist in the West. So I'd love to hear about how you kind of navigated through the cultural differences and the immaturity, for lack of a better term, to get them to understand why what you were doing actually mattered for their business,
Patience. Lots of patience. I'll never forget. I had a senior person at one of the institutions I worked at who was a very aggressive, successful banker say to me, "You're just another American pushing a law on us, and this is our jurisdiction." And I'll never forget that.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that kind of put me in my place respectfully, to help understand his point of view, but also showed me that I need to be patient in time, and eventually I will get him to convert. And I did eventually. It took help from senior folks back in the US in the headquarters, but it also took a lot of grit and the demonstration that in compliance, no one in compliance should be deal killers, blockers. That should never be the case. We should be facilitators of growth, and we should communicate that, hey, I'm here to help you make revenue, and here are your options, and here are the risks for each of those options, and you make the decision. And I think over time, people eventually the front office appreciates that approach, and I think that's what I found successful when I was out there.
Yeah, so it was kind of more like an accumulation of interactions that painted you in a light that was maybe different than what their expectation was or something. It wasn't 100%. You just worded it in a magical way that they were like, "Oh, okay."
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and I've seen this before, compliance officers will walk into the senior business leader and they start off with either a very aggressive physical approach or demeanor when they're about to say some bad news, rather than easing into the conversation, helping them understand the work you've done to come to this conclusion, and helping them understand what the risk may be if they do proceed in a certain direction. And, I think 9 times out of 10, the business leaders appreciate that approach, that you're not protecting the firm, you're protecting them.
Well, and also you got to live kind of up close and personal, kind of saddle to saddle with these sort of masters of the universe who live in such a risk world, I mean, their business is making bets about the future, which I guess at some level is everyone's bet. I mean, maybe that's every human's bet, or every human's life is kind of characterized by that. But I'm just saying their business is generating a return. They're doing that by buying companies that are based on some financial model that's held together by a series of assumptions, macro, micro, whatever. So they live in that risk world. They're relatively higher risk. They have a relatively higher risk appetite than, let's say, the average person. And so it seems like in that kind of environment, it's you have to get really good at the sort of like interpersonal judo to get your agenda across without like them feeling like they're getting choked out, you know?
That's 100% correct. That's accurate. And, a lot of these people, the front office folks, are incredibly financially successful beyond belief. And they're in the position where things have always worked for them. And
Yeah, exactly.
we got to be the bearer of bad news saying, look, I mean, this could potentially get you extradited to the United States if you move forward with this, or this could completely kill your entire fund when you have to pay a $10 billion fee, not in those words. I think it helps them understand where you're coming from. And a lot of these individuals came from organizations via acquisitions that were not bound by such rigorous regulations, such as the US and UK. So their culture had to adapt once they moved into a large publicly traded firm.
Yeah, that's something I hadn't really considered, because you have, these sort of different company types. BlackRock itself grows through acquisition, not just from a portfolio perspective. And then as somebody gets folded into the full platform, they're subject to all those regulations and all those rules and all that kind of stuff. Did you find navigating, I kind of came from private equity, so it seems like there's a disproportionate percentage of private equity folks, investment banking folks. Private equity and investment bankers don't listen to this, so I can just speak freely, but they don't think that they're average. They don't think that they're every other guy. They are different. There's like everybody else. There's the other guy, and then there's me. That's what I think. That's my experience. Okay. Did you find that to be the case? And did you find navigating through that to be a little more difficult than navigating through that for, one of your ensuing later, like just, general economy type clients with your consulting business?
100%. 100%. I couldn't agree with you more. I would say most of them initially start off in that kind of view. But I think that's, part of socializing your purpose, part of helping them understand why you're doing this, eventually will get them to adapt. But the initial meeting is a one-off just wall. Like, I'm on this side, you're on this side, and we're not together, for sure.
Well, even within the firm, there's, in my experience, there's a different, if you're on the deal team, you're like the guy. And it's like, well, we're all doing different things. Obviously, this deal team can only exist with all these other support groups. So establishing that sort of, what's the word? Like that sort of symbiotic relationship, and proving to them that like what you're bringing to the table is actually in their best interest and better for themselves is, I think, probably a little bit more difficult in that business, just given the personality types that you're dealing with.
100%. Yeah. If you put it, you're doing training for an equities trading team, which there's little to no risk there, but you do training because you want to blanket the whole organization, versus training a private equity team that holds portfolio companies in high-risk industries and jurisdictions. Those are very two different recipients of the information that you're getting, 100%.
So do you feel like, I've been talking to a couple of guests recently, it just sort of organically has come up, this concept of design thinking, where we're not focused on the policy itself, but rather we're focused on the user experience and how I can get this policy to drive that individual's behaviors, right?
Yep.
Do you feel like you came into this opportunity with that thinking already? Or do you feel like, because what you just described is design thinking, saying like, I have to do training. I might need to give different training to the equity or to the private equity team versus the equity trading team, because there's different risk profiles and different personalities, perhaps, whatever. Right. Did you kind of figure that out on your own, or did you kind of come in with that kind of mentality already?
Came in with that mentality because I knew they were two very different functions. And also, I think it ties down into delivering. If we're speaking about training, it ties down to delivering training that is tailored to the business unit to help them understand the concepts of how they will need to look at these risks in their day-to-day roles. So, training an HR function versus a private equity team and kind of same thing. It's very, very different.
So, was that hard to do because you had so many different groups within there, or did you just kind of start whittling away at it? And I'm asking this question in the context of this is just my impression from conversations with folks in our space, that, we come to webinars and we listen to podcasts and we hear these concepts and they're like, yes, I love that. Okay, cool. We need to get more behavioral science in our program, whatever the topic du jour is, right? But then it's like, where do I start? And sometimes it feels like it's a massive mountain and they don't know where to start. They want to activate middle managers. How do I get these guys doing it? Great concept. Fine. I need a bunch of compliance champions. How do I actually make that happen?
Yep.
You were faced with that yourself, and you're talking about it as if you did figure it out, which I'm sure you did. But I'm saying, like, how did you kind of start attacking it? Was it really like there's nothing in place and I just have to kind of purpose build everything sort of on a bespoke basis? Or was it like there's something in place and I just need to kind of tweak this for this group and I got to tweak that for the other group? What was that process like?
Yeah, so I think it's important in our scenario, because we had an active investigation. It was very important for us to have a roadmap of how we were going to address
Got you. Okay.
each of the business units. So on whether it's training or technology build or whatever it was, we had to look at the business units to see which ones were higher risk. Our investigation was focused on the China real estate fund, so it was within our investment business, starting with them and then working our way back. I will say that over time, because you're dealing with such a large organization, it's harder to be smart about how you focus that information and tailor it over time. And I think you're right that you have to be much more strategic how you're doing that faster rather than, over a 3 or 4 year period, kind of going through your roadmap, because otherwise you're just, going from one unit to the next and there's nothing to it.
Yeah, you're playing whack-a-mole. I mean, it's interesting. At the start of this, you talked about kind of a risk-based approach and kind of taking, I mean, the corollary to that in the context of what you're talking about is really kind of taking a Pareto approach. Like, what is the thing that I can do that's going to move the needle the most? What's the 20% of factors that I can focus my efforts on that are going to drive 80% of the results I'm looking for, and kind of iterating through that versus just being like, cool, I'll just kind of fix that, and cool, I'll just fix that. Like, there's no forward motion then. And you just end up kind of feeling like, there's no waves in the ocean. It's just like a placid lake or something.
Yeah, no, that's 100% right. And I tried to do that at BlackRock as well. The problem is when you're dealing with such big, large organizations with so many different business units across so many jurisdictions, it's hard to take those data points and communicate that strategy to each of the areas across the firm in an efficient manner, right? So if I look at Asia, where there's oil platforms, there's logistics centers in China and so forth, where there's a lot of potential risk, you can focus on that one area, but drilling down into each of those different assets takes time and a lot of communication. It's much harder to do at a bigger organization.
Yeah, it's not only by organization size, but organization type, where they're intersecting with all these different industries and all these different things. So like, was the focus of the program that you put in place, this might sound like a stupid question, but was the focus of the program that you put in place, was it really focused on like internal BlackRock compliance, like how BlackRock needs to comply? Or was it trying to inform them and get them a little bit smart on finding perhaps compliance risks in an acquisition they're looking at, or both, or what? Like, what was the line there?
Yeah, both simultaneous. I think, we had to do it concurrently because, at the time we were a relatively new function, the financial crime compliance team. And it was originally an AML only team. And as we built out the team based on risk, sanctions, fraud, ABC, and so forth, we had to adapt. Getting resources in these organizations where they tend to stay very, very lean, it's harder to be much more strategic.
I see what you're saying. I see. Yeah. So, I mean, in many ways, like, as I'm hearing your story, it's kind of this like extreme version of like someone stepping into a company, a manufacturing company, say, who has to set up a compliance program, because you have both kind of like the business pressures, right? Like, that is a profit maximizing machine. BlackRock, any private equity fund, they're in the business of generating a return. I mean, their product is money. It's not a widget that is worth money. So there's that layer. There's the profit motive that can sometimes like be a stiff arm for the development of some back end function that, is not clear how that contributes to the the value of the enterprise, right?
Absolutely.
And it's multiplied by, I mean, there's just like a, multi-dimensional thing here. It's multiplied by the complexity of all the industries that it touches. It's multiplied by the complexity of it itself being a highly regulated organization, and investment companies highly regulated, plus all the international things. So, so how did you go? I'm just so fascinated by this. Like it sounds like you were trying to get these guys kind of just smarter about kind of risk. That's what their job is. Their job is to build a financial model and go to investment committee that outline, with a proposal or whatever that is going to say, hey, here are the risks. So it sounds like what you were really trying to do is like give them a new lens to look at the business, not just the business risks, but what are some of these compliance and like maybe perhaps regulatory risks that might influence the return that they're expecting to come from this asset or this investment.
Absolutely. And, one of the conversations that I constantly had with the deal teams was, return to their investment, right? Which we have talked about in the past, and trying to explain that to them and understand that. In some cases, their clients would ask BlackRock, the deal teams, tell us what anti-corruption programs you have in place to protect our monies. And at one point, this was a big win. At one point, a state oil fund of a country who was a big client of BlackRock's asked for training for myself on what was implemented at BlackRock. And that kind of raised eyebrows of the investment team.
That raised your status internally big time. It's like, this is the guy I'm trying to sell. I mean, that's the client. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And I ended up giving a training, an ABC training to sovereign wealth funds.
Interesting.
So compliance became a part of this academy that BlackRock, it's called BlackRock Educational Academy. They bring in their top clients from all over the world. It's in multiple cities. Compliance became a piece of that front office training, which was really, really important.
So, I mean, I'm always talking about like, we got to conquer more land. Like that is prime real estate that you were able to conquer and be a part of. I mean, that's phenomenal. But again, what I think the message here is for those listening is like, you didn't force your way into that. You added value in a way where they were like, hey, come on in here. And I think when we can stop thinking in like the conditional tense of should and thinking about like what is that people are going to pursue their own self-interest. And if they can see that, you help me get more of my self-interest, well, then it's very easy to open the door and pull up a chair to the big, the grown folks table or whatever you want to call it.
Yep. No, that's exactly right. Exactly right.
So what made you transition out? And, I know you said that you went to business school and you've always had this sort of entrepreneurial like itch, let's say. What was it about kind of like your path there at BlackRock and your comfortability in Asia, which clearly you built some of that to say, okay, you know what, it's time now to kind of hit the eject button and go kind of hang out a shingle myself.
Yeah. So only live once, right? So
yeah, that's right.
I think it was a mix of things. Going back to what we originally talked about, being in the preventative versus reactive phase after an investigation. For 10 years, we've been in a preventative phase. Built a program from the ground up, well-oiled machine that is operating globally. So I felt like that we got where we needed to for what we had at BlackRock. Just some of my network said to me, Greg, you're doing all this work within private equity and portcos for BlackRock. Why are you not doing this by yourself? So I just started talking to some mentors and friends, former colleagues, on the thoughts of, whether this was an opportunity to go in on. I mean, a lot of these portcos or funds are engaging consultants or outside counsel for in-house compliance work.
Right.
And a lot of these folks don't have in-house compliance experience, right? And I think my offering is that I can look at a wind farm in the Philippines and say quite easily where the risks lie, what we need to do to mitigate those risks instantly. And I think, having the background at Morgan Stanley and at BlackRock, it's a special offering.
Well, it is a special offering, and what you kind of described is what I think is a special skill. I think if you work in investment banking or financial services or consulting or, obviously this came along with your experience, probably in both of those spots, you get good at getting smart on something fast.
Yep.
right? Like you have to, because there's a time crunch, there's a deal deadline, there's an LOI due or whatever. It's like, you got to dive into an industry that maybe you don't know, or it's a company you don't know. And very quickly you get good, I think the ones that are good at this, very quickly, they can find those big risks.
Yep.
And I think the ones that are bad at it are the ones that try to kind of start from a, let's say, kind of a bottom up perspective and say, like, here are all the risks that could exist, and I'm going to look under every single one of those rocks. Many times you just don't have time for that, right? So you have to build this kind of muscle to like learn a language quickly, so to speak. And that's not something that like you can just learn from a book, I don't think. I think you have to like swim in that in that kind of an ocean, you know?
Sure. And one of the problems I've faced at BlackRock, or one of the challenges, is working with the deal team saying, hey, across your 8 portfolio companies, y'all need to be doing this. And their response was always, as you mentioned, we're deal people. We're trying to make deals. We got to meet quotas, go to IC meetings with 10 deals a year. We don't have time for this.
Right.
Those are my words, not their words.
Yeah.
But they were always forthcoming and saying, look, we want to put this in place. We want to protect our assets, but we have to find the balance of resources.
Right.
I possibly cannot be at every portfolio company that BlackRock owns, majority owned portfolio company. So, there's got to be someone out there that can provide that service at that level, so the deal teams can continue to move forward and be fiduciaries to their investors.
Yeah. So that's so cool. So you hung out your shingle. You were in Shanghai for some time doing this work. How did you find that process? Like, did you find it, like, I guess, what were you surprised by? Was it easier than you thought? Was it harder than you thought? Was it kind of, sometimes you like, I don't know, you like go skiing for the first time and you're like, whoa, I didn't even know I had a muscle there. I'm sore. I'm sore somewhere I've never been before. Was there any of that?
It was quite easy. I think at the time, there was a lot of U.S. investors looking into China on the back of their real estate boom, and bringing money into the country. A lot of small to mid-tier funds didn't have compliance or legal people on the ground, right?
Which made them kind of like not even viable for one of these, foreign investors then, probably.
Yeah, exactly. So, one of my first clients when I was over there said to me, hey, one of our investors from California just called and wants to know what compliance programs we have in place, because they were a cash business and they were moving bags of cash in a legitimate parking garage business. So they wanted a full out compliance program to help protect those monies. So I think it was pretty amazing. I probably would still be there doing it if it wasn't for the pollution.
Oh, was it is as bad as they say, huh?
Yeah, it is bad. It is getting better. But at the time I'd had my first daughter, and it was, she was very sick. So that was the downside of it.
So what was the driver to do that in Shanghai versus Hong Kong, where it sounds like you were living for most of your time out there?
My wife is from Shanghai.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Easy. That's an easy answer.
Yeah, easy. Hong Kong is, I'd say it's New York City on steroids, and it's a very easy place to live. Kind of with what I did at the UN, I felt like jumping off a cliff and trying something new, and wanted to say that I lived in mainland China and survived, and it was an amazing experience.
Man, that's so cool. So then after that, you did what?
Went to BlackRock.
Oh yeah. That was BlackRock. Okay, that's
Yep.
right. I missed that. But then you came back to the States.
Came back to the States. Yep. So I was asked in 2019 if I was ready to come home. To be clear, all my stakeholders are in New York City, so they let me run my global program from Asia for personal reasons. My wife being over there. 2019 with the protests and the COVID in 2020 for us kicked off. It was time for us to come back to the States. So they moved me back to Atlanta, be closer to my stakeholders in New York City. And then that's where I've been the last 3 years up until this summer.
Cool. So, you've seen 1,000 different businesses. You've been in these highly regulated industries with some of these challenges, maybe on steroids as well, that other folks face. What is your so you've seen a lot, and you're now you now have a consulting practice. What do you see consistently when you come into a client as the biggest fire to put out? Or what's the big, again, getting back to that 80-20 rule, what do you consistently see as man, if we can just fix this, then a lot of this stuff comes unlocked. Because my kind of position is that, compliance is not like, I mean, it's still new-ish, but it's not like a brand new baby anymore. It's maybe it's maybe a tween. Okay.
Yep.
And so at that stage, in my experience, when you're not starting from scratch, it's like small tweaks to what you're doing usually have a disproportionate impact. And so the bet then becomes, or the calculus becomes like, well, where am I spending my time? What bets with my time am I making that are going to have that biggest impact? Do you see any trends when you come in somewhere?
100%.
Yeah. What are those?
So, consistent, inconsistent data pipes. So where's data across the organization, and how to get those pipes into a technology or solution to monitor your risk. So it's a massive problem, especially in organizations when they grow through acquisitions. You might have a real estate team that's made up of 3 different companies, and those data pipes out of each of those old companies don't talk to each other. But yet you want to manage that entire fund.
Yeah.
That is a consistent problem that I see. And hence why, as part of my consulting practice, I want to help organizations look into technology that can help oversee their risk at their funds. Right. So we built at BlackRock, I designed internally a tech solution for anti-bribery compliance across all of our portfolios. So the chief compliance officer, heads of all the funds, can actually go into a dashboard and they can look across their funds and see where their risks are by country, by industry, wherever they want.
So that was a real like data exercise for sure.
6 years.
Jeez, man. Wild.
Yeah.
Wild. That's wild.
Yeah.
It's just kind of interesting. Like, a roll-up strategy is not new anymore. Everybody does that now. And so it's very easy. Everyone's like, cool, let's just sort of rationalize this group and we'll roll up these operations and we'll roll up, HR and whatever. But it's like the conversation about rolling up like risk is not, it's not up there with like accounting. Accounting's the easy one. You know what I'm saying? It's like, okay, cool. We can delete this accounting team. We can throw a couple extra heads over here. But it's like that same mindset doesn't go to risk. Do you think it's because, some of the things I mentioned are easy to kind of like, slot in and slot out, and risk is something that's more sort of like it kind of permeates the soil? Like why is that not in the same bucket as HR or some of these other sort of quote unquote support functions that are
That's a fair question.
Part of every freaking roll-up strategy,
That's a fair question. I wish I knew the answer. Compliance would be a lot easier. I think, for some of these, especially these organizations that come up through acquisition that are not bound by these regulations, and it's a little bit loosey-goosey where they previously operated. I don't think that they have the systems or the platforms to even understand what those risks are, let alone having a compliance officer that's monitoring what they're doing. You have an organization like that comes up, and then you have an organization that comes on that maybe was based in the US that was regulated because they trade in US dollars or, have US investors. And those two acquisitions are not talking to each other. And for some reason, the risk line item for those two organizations just don't line up.
Right. So, as we kind of wrap up here, I can't believe we're already done with an hour. But as we wrap up, I want to share this thing with you. I can't remember if I've shared this with you before, but I'd love to get your perspective on it. And I'd love to get some perspective on what do you think we as an industry should do to change this trend? Okay. So I was at a conference and Pat Harned from ECI was there. And she was showing this data from their, global business survey, which they do every year, every couple of years or something. And so she showed a time series of responses from the survey over like the last 12 years. So we have 2013, 2017, 2020, and 2023. Yep. And the line is measuring the proportion of respondents who agreed to the fact that they work at a high integrity organization. Okay. And the numbers were 61% in 2013, 60% in 2017. So 61, 60. In 2020, it was up to 61. And then in 2023, it's fell down to 60. So again, we have 10-year period plus 10, call it 10 over the last 10 years. The proportion of respondents who say that they're working in a high integrity organization has been flat. So when I was in the room, I was like, cool, this is a lot of upside. This is a lot of opportunity. I think I was one of the only people who was thinking that, because I felt the like energy in the room kind of drop a little bit. And so, and I think, we were getting coffee after that session and somebody was like, man, all this stuff we've been doing, it's not even moving the needle. And so I see that as an opportunity, because I think a lot of the old approaches aren't going to work in this new era, or continuing to do what we've always, it's like, there's a lot of fat people who just keep climbing the Stairmaster and aren't getting any results, right? Like, you got to do something a little different sometimes. So why do you think that is? And like, how do you think we break this trend? I mean, because that's a big trend. 10 years is a lot. And there's been a lot of innovation in our space. There's been a lot more talk of these tactics and behavioral science and, all these other things that should, in theory, sort of start to move that lineup. Yeah,
I don't know. That's a difficult question. Depending on what was in the questionnaires that they accumulated and looked at, aggregated and looked at. I think we went through a time in the early 2000s with high regulatory enforcement, right? Like in one specific area, FCPA, when I got into it, was the big thing. Now I talk to outside counsel of Magic Circle law firms, and they're like, it's no more. Like, nothing's going to happen until the new administration comes in. It may not even happen then. People are talking cybersecurity and privacy now. So, with the different changes of areas of risk, I wonder if people's views of an organization with integrity changes. So
interesting. That's an interesting response. Yeah, right? Please keep going.
FCPA, anti-money laundering was also very, very big, always will be big, versus a privacy and cybersecurity. I mean, what's an individual's view on, whether those are honest type?
Good point.
Yeah, you know what I mean? So
yeah, I do.
I'm not sure. That's a difficult question. I mean, personally, as a professional in the space, I do see the advancement. I see the technology. I look at the providers, probably some of the similar people that and it is going in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree, but I think that answer is so interesting, because it's almost like, well, there's maybe a moving goalpost as to like what good is, and that could be influenced by whatever's in the headlines, whatever folks are focused on.
Yeah, exactly. No, you look at, I remember the AML case at HSBC out of Mexico, and I remember the day that they hired 4,500 financial crime professionals in APAC.
Wow.
4,500.
That's wild.
After their investigation. And then 3 years later, no one talked about it anymore when we were living out there. Right. And it was on to the next thing and next organization that made this drastic change in the ethics and compliance world.
Yeah. Which again kind of comes back to perhaps the importance of like consistently talking about it. You have to keep kind of singing that song to remind folks, because we have short attention spans, Yeah,
100%. I mean, it is an exhausting job to have, right? And especially when you're trying to shift culture of large organizations and those that have grown through acquisition.
Yeah. So Greg, where can people find you? I'd love for you to kind of plug your business a little bit. I think you got a really tremendous background, and I think you're really this kind of forward thinker that more of us need to become to really kind of change the slope of that line that I was just talking about. So tell us where we can find you and a little bit more about your business as we wrap up.
Yeah, so I'm currently building out the admin of the company, so it's Conformitize. You can find me on LinkedIn, and as I tell everybody, I like to call it Compliance 3.0, and kind of forward thinking like you are as well, Nick. Happy to have open conversations anytime with anyone. Just want to bounce ideas off of. One of my favorite things in this role is benchmarking and learning from peers and what everybody else is seeing, because it only makes me smarter. So happy to have those chats.
I love it. Well, great to have you on, Greg, and we will see you next time.
All right. Thanks, Nick.
See ya.